Hello there and welcome to Mysteries Beneath Earth, where we trade the noise of the day for the quiet rhythm of deep time, and where we let curiosity guide us into places that science has mapped but imagination still struggles to comprehend. Tonight, we are going to a place that you think you know, a place that exists in your mind as a singular, absolute color, white. We are going to Antarctica. But we are not going to the Antarctica of today, that vast, frozen fortress at the bottom of the world where the wind screams over miles of crushing ice. We are going to the Antarctica that lies beneath, or rather, the Antarctica that came before. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing at the South Pole, but instead of a parka, you are wearing a light jacket. Instead of the blinding glare of sun on snow, you are standing in the dappled shade of a canopy so thick it blocks the sky. The air around you is damp, smelling of pine needles, wet earth, and the heavy, sweet scent of decay that comes from a forest floor teeming with life. There is no ice here. There is only green, a green so deep and relentless that it covers continents. This sounds like a dream or perhaps a mistake, but it is neither. It is the memory of the Earth. Tonight, we are going to walk through the forests of Antarctica. We are going to ask how a continent that sits on the axis of the world, plunged into total darkness for months at a time, once hosted jungles, dinosaurs, and towering trees. We are going to look for the ghosts of this green world, and we are going to ask what happened to turn a paradise into a desert of ice. So, wherever you are tonight, maybe you're curled up under a blanket or watching the city lights drift by outside your window. Let yourself settle in. Let the cold of the present fade away, and let's drift back millions of years to a time when the ice was just a rumor and the South Pole was alive. When we look at a map of the world today, Antarctica sits at the bottom like a heavy anchor. It is a place of extremes, the coldest, windiest, and driest continent on Earth. It is a desert, though its dunes are made of ice crystals rather than sand. To the human mind, Antarctica is synonymous with hostility. It is a place that does not want us. It preserves its solitude with a shield of freezing oceans and a cap of ice that is, in some places, nearly 3 miles thick. This ice is the defining feature of the continent. It buries the mountains, fills the valleys, and crushes the land beneath a weight so immense that the tectonic plate itself has been pushed down into the mantle. Feels permanent, eternal, as if it has always been there and always will be. But geology tells us that this ice is an interloper. It is a recent guest in the deep history of the planet. The first clue that something was wrong with our image of an eternal white Antarctica came not from high-tech satellites or climate models, but from the rough, blackened hands of early explorers. In the early 20th century, during the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, men like Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton were trudging across the Transantarctic Mountains. They were fighting frostbite, starvation, and the sheer crushing exhaustion of hauling sledges across the polar plateau. And yet, in the midst of this frozen hell, they found something impossible that in 1912, members of Scott's ill-fated Terra Nova expedition, specifically Edward Wilson and Henry Bowers, stopped to collect geological samples. They were exhausted, dragging their bodies toward a rescue that would never come, but they were scientists first. They picked up rocks from the Beardmore Glacier, one of the desolate highways of ice cutting through the mountains. When they looked closely at these rocks, they didn't see just granite or basalt. They saw coal. Coal is a rock made of memory. It is the compressed, fossilized remains of ancient swamps, peat bogs, and forests. It is made of carbon that was once pulled from the air by leaves, processed by sunlight, and stored in the trunks of massive trees. To find coal is to find proof of life. To find coal in the middle of the Antarctic ice sheet is a paradox so jarring it demands an explanation. How could a place that kills every green thing today have once produced enough vegetation to create thick seams of coal? When rescuers eventually found the bodies of Scott and his men, they also found the 35 pounds of rocks they had refused to abandon even as they lay dying. Among those rocks were fossils of leaves, large, tongue-shaped leaves with a distinctive midrib and a network of veins. These were leaves of Glossopteris, a tree that grew in thick, deciduous forests. They were not small, stunted tundra plants. They were the leaves of great trees that shed their foliage in autumn, creating deep carpets of litter on a forest floor. The discovery was a whisper from the deep past, a signal that the ice was a lie. But it would take decades more for science to fully listen to what that whisper was saying. Today, we have drilled deep into the ice and even deeper into the seabed surrounding the continent. We have found pollen grains, spores, and microscopic waxes from leaves. We have found petrified wood on islands that are now little more than rock and snow. And what we have pieced together is a story that challenges our understanding of how the Earth works. We have learned that for the vast majority of Earth's history, perhaps 85% of it, Antarctica was not white. It was green. It did not host penguins and seals huddled against the wind. It hosted amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals that browsed in lush canopies. This realization forces us to confront a strangeness in the planet's character. We tend to think of the climate we live in now, with ice caps at both poles, as normal. But in the long view of geology, we are the odd ones. We are living in an icehouse Earth, a rare state where the poles are frozen. For most of time, Earth was a greenhouse, and the poles were not barriers to life, but sanctuaries for it. But acknowledging that Antarctica was green is only the first step. The real mystery lies in the how. It is one thing to have a forest in the tropics, where the sun shines every day. It is another thing entirely to have a forest at the South Pole. Even if the world was warmer, the geometry of the solar system hasn't changed. Antarctica has sat over the southern polar region for over 100 million years. That means that even when it was warm, it was still subject to the tilt of the Earth. It still faced the polar night. Imagine a forest that must survive not just cold, but darkness. Imagine trees that must go to sleep for 4 or 5 months at a time, standing in total, ink-black darkness while the temperatures hover above freezing. How does a tree photosynthesize without a sun? How does an ecosystem function when the energy source, the sun, simply vanishes for a third of the year? These were not just forests, they were alien ecosystems. They were polar forests, a biome that does not exist anywhere on Earth today. There is no modern analog. If you were to walk into those woods, you would see plants that look familiar, ferns, conifers, ancestors of the beech tree, but they would be behaving in ways that modern plants do not. The mystery of the green Antarctica is not just a question of what was there. It is a question of how the Earth supports life in the extremes. It is a story of resilience, of adaptation, and ultimately of a tragic slow-motion erasure. As we stand here in the imagination, looking at the ice of today, we have to realize that the ice is a vault. It has locked away the evidence of this green world, grinding mountains to dust and scraping the continent clean. But the ice is not perfect. Around the edges, on the islands of the Antarctic Peninsula, and deep in the sediments of the Southern Ocean, the vault has cracked open. Tonight, we are going to pry that door open further. we are going to reconstruct the lost world, branch by branch, leaf by leaf. But before we can see the forests, we have to understand the land they stood on. Because the Antarctica of the past was not an island at the bottom of the world. It was the beating heart of a supercontinent. To understand the forests of the past, we have to redraw the map of the world. We have to forget the isolated, lonely continent of Antarctica that we see on our globes today, that white disk surrounded by the churning blue of the Southern Ocean. We have to go back to a time when the continents were not strangers to one another but family. About 180 million years ago, in the Jurassic period, the southern hemisphere was dominated by a single colossal landmass. This was Gondwana. It was a supercontinent that contained nearly all of the land that is today South America, Africa, Australia, India, and Antarctica. But Antarctica was not just a piece of this puzzle, it was the keystone. It sat right in the center, a massive hub that connected all the others. If you were a dinosaur in the Jurassic, you could walk from what is now Brazil through Africa, cross into Antarctica, and keep walking until you reached Australia, all without ever getting your feet wet. Antarctica was the bridge. It was the great migration highway of the southern world. This central position is crucial to our story. Because it was landlocked in the center of the supercontinent, the Antarctica of the Jurassic and early Cretaceous was not defined by the ocean as it is today. It was defined by its neighbors. Warm winds from the tropics could flow down through South America and Africa, reaching deep into the polar interior. The ocean currents, which today circle Antarctica and trap the cold air in, were blocked by the massive limbs of the other continents. The cold couldn't get a foothold at this deep time. The world was warmer. Carbon dioxide levels were perhaps 5 times higher than they are today. The greenhouse effect was in full swing. There were no polar ice caps. The sea levels were higher, flooding the lowlands and creating shallow inland seas, but the highlands of Antarctica were dry and habitable. The geological record of this time gives us a picture of a landscape that feels impossible. In the Transantarctic Mountains, which today are buried up to their necks in ice, geologists have found fossilized roots. Not just small roots, but massive, woody structures indicating large trees. They have found beds of sandstone deposited by wide, lazy rivers. Rivers that would have rivaled the Mississippi or the Amazon. Think about that for a moment. Rivers in Antarctica. Today, the only water in Antarctica is frozen or hidden in subglacial lakes under miles of pressure. But back then, water flowed. It carved valleys, it carried sediment, and it fed vast floodplains. This was the Gondwanan flora. It was a botanical empire that stretched across the entire southern world. The dominant trees were not the flowering broadleaf trees we see in most forests today. Those were just beginning to evolve. The rulers of these forests were the gymnosperms, the conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos. The most famous of these was the Glossopteris we mentioned earlier, but as we move into the Cretaceous period, the time of the dinosaurs, the forests began to change. The Glossopteris gave way to new giants. The Araucaria trees began to rise. You might know them today as the monkey puzzle trees, with their spiky, triangular leaves and strange, reptilian bark. Today, they are rare relics found in small pockets of Chile and Australia. But in the Cretaceous, they were the kings of Antarctica. They were joined by podocarps, another family of conifers that still dominates the southern hemisphere's temperate rainforests. These trees created a canopy that was thick and evergreen. Below them, the understory was a riot of ferns. Ferns love moisture, and the Antarctica of this time was wet. The warm air held vast amounts of humidity, and because there was no ice cap to lock up the water, rainfall was abundant. But Gondwana was not destined to last. The engine of plate tectonics, driven by the churning heat of the Earth's mantle, began to tear the family apart. It started slowly. Africa broke away first, unzipping from South America and opening the South Atlantic Ocean. India broke loose and began its long, lonely sprint north toward Asia. But for a long time, the big three of the South America, Australia, and Antarctica held together. They formed a final, smaller supercontinent, sometimes called West Gondwana. This connection is vital because it allowed plants and animals to share their genetic heritage. It explains why the forests of Patagonia today look so similar to the forests of Tasmania. They are cousins, separated by an ocean but born from the same Antarctic motherland. The fossil evidence for this connection is startling. We find the same species of beetles, the same families of trees, and even the same types of marsupials in South America and Australia. The only way they could have crossed is through Antarctica. The continent was a lush, green corridor. Imagine the view from space during the mid-Cretaceous around 100 million years ago. If you looked down at the South Pole, you wouldn't see a white dot. You would see a swirl of deep green, broken by the silver veins of great rivers and the blue of inland lakes. You would see mountain ranges that were not capped in white, but cloaked in verdant forests climbing up to the tree-line. It was a world that breathed. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acted as a blanket, trapping the sun's heat and distributing it evenly around the globe. The temperature gradient between the equator and the poles was much shallower than it is today. That means the storms were different, less violent, perhaps, driven less by the clash of hot and cold air and more by the gentle, humid circulation of a greenhouse world. But this paradise came with a catch. The geography provided the warmth, but the astronomy provided the darkness. As Gondwana broke apart, Antarctica remained stubbornly fixed over the pole. It didn't drift north into the sun. It stayed put, anchoring the bottom of the world. This sets the stage for the greatest ecological puzzle of all. We have the heat, we have the water, we have the land, but we do not have the light. As we move deeper into the Cretaceous, we have to look at how life solved the impossible problem of the polar night. How do you build a rainforest when the sun sets in April and doesn't rise again until August? To find the answer, we have to travel to a specific island on the edge of the continent, a place called Alexander Island, where the fossils are so well preserved that you can still see the rings in the wood, measuring the pulse of seasons that passed 100 million years ago. Let us narrow our focus now. We are zooming in from the massive scale of supercontinents to a specific moment in time and a specific place in space. The time is the mid-Cretaceous, roughly 100 to 110 million years ago. The place is Alexander Island. Today, Alexander Island is the largest island of Antarctica, lying just off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. It is a place of stark, brutal beauty, locked in the grip of the George VI ice shelf. Glaciers spill down its sides, and the wind scours the rock bare. But if you know where to look, specifically in the sedimentary rocks of the fossil bluff group, you can step straight into a Cretaceous woodland. The fossils found here are not just impressions of leaves scattered by the wind. They are fossil forests. We find tree trunks standing upright, preserved in their original growth positions. Their roots are still embedded in the ancient soil, or paleosol, which has turned to stone around them. This is crucial because it tells us these trees weren't washed here by a flood from warmer lands. They grew here, they lived, fought for nutrients, and died right here at a latitude of about 70 to 75 degrees south. So what did this forest look like? If you stepped out of a time machine onto the Alexander Island of 100 million years ago, the first thing you would notice is the space. This was not a choked, impenetrable jungle like the Amazon. It was an open woodland. The great trees, mostly araucarians and podocarps, stood like pillars, spaced widely apart. This spacing was likely an adaptation to the light, which we will discuss later, but it gave the forest a cathedral-like quality. The ground beneath your feet would be soft and spongy, covered in a thick carpet of mosses and liverworts. But the dominant understory plant wasn't grass. Grasses were still evolving and hadn't yet conquered the world. Instead, the ground was dominated by ferns. Ferns of every shape and size, uncurling their fronds in the damp air. We also find evidence of disturbance vegetation. This is a fascinating detail from the fossil record. Along the banks of the ancient rivers that flowed through Alexander Island, we see plants that specialize in rapid growth, weeds of the Cretaceous. They tell us that these rivers were active. They flooded seasonally, tearing up the banks and creating fresh mud for new life to colonize. It was a dynamic, changing landscape. The climate data we can extract from these rocks is astonishing. By analyzing the chemistry of the fossil wood and the types of clay minerals in the soil, scientists have reconstructed the weather report from 100 million years ago. The mean annual temperature was roughly 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, about 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound hot. It's comparable to the climate of modern-day Vancouver, Wellington, or Seattle. But remember, this is near the South Pole. In winter, the temperature rarely, if ever, dropped far below freezing. Frosts were likely rare and light. The ocean, warm and circulating freely, acted as a massive radiator, keeping the harsh freeze at bay. The rainfall was abundant, likely over 1,000 millimeters a year. It was a wet, misty world. You can imagine the atmosphere. Quiet, dampened by the moss, with the constant drip of water from the canopy. The air would be rich in oxygen, and even richer in carbon dioxide. One of the most remarkable discoveries from Alexander Island is the diversity of the trees. We find the ancestors of the ginkgo tree. Today, Ginkgo biloba is a living fossil, the last of its kind, often planted in city streets because it is so tough. But in the Cretaceous, ginkgos were diverse and widespread. Their fan-shaped leaves would have turned a brilliant yellow in the autumn, dropping to form golden carpets on the forest floor. We also find the first signs of the revolution that was sweeping the plant world, the angiosperms, or flowering plants. In the early Cretaceous, they were small, shrubby invaders living in the shadow of the giant conifers. But as the era progressed, they began to take over. We see the ancestors of the Nothofagus, the southern beech, beginning to claim their place. These forests were not silent. While we often focus on the big dinosaurs, the undergrowth would have been buzzing with life. Insects were thriving. We find evidence of beetles boring into the wood of the ancient trees. We find dragonflies. We find the complex interplay of predator and prey on a miniature scale. But the most striking thing about the Alexander Island forests is their ring structure. When paleobotanists cut thin slices of this fossilized wood and look at it under a microscope, they see wide, clear growth rings. Tree rings are calendars. A wide ring means a good year, plenty of water, plenty of warmth, rapid growth. A narrow ring means stress. In modern trees at high latitudes, the rings are often tiny, showing how much the cold stunts their growth. But the Antarctic trees have rings that look like they belong in a temperate zone. They grew fast and hard. However, the rings also tell us about the light. The transition from the light spring wood to the dark late wood is sharp. This indicates a rapid shutdown of growth. The trees didn't just slow down because it got a little chilly. They stopped because the light went out. This brings us to the edge of the great paradox. We have established that the climate was warm. We have established that the water was flowing. But we cannot escape the tilt of the Earth. At 75 degrees south, the sun would set sometime in late April. It would dip below the horizon and it would not come back. May, June, July. These months would be swallowed by a twilight that deepened into a true starry night. How did a forest as productive as a modern temperate rainforest survive 3 months of total darkness? How did the seedlings survive without sunlight to fuel them? How did the trees avoid freezing when the heat source disappeared? The plants of the Cretaceous Antarctica were not just transplants from the tropics. They were highly specialized, evolutionary geniuses that had solved the problem of the dark. And to understand their secret, we have to look not just at their wood, but at their leaves, the solar panels of the ancient world. The Cretaceous greenhouse was a golden age, a time when the Earth pushed life to its absolute limits. It proved that if you give life enough heat and enough carbon, it can conquer even the poles. But as we stand in this ancient, misty forest, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon for the long winter, we have to ask, what happens next? How does the forest sleep? That is the question of the polar night, and it is where the mystery deepens. If you have ever kept a houseplant, you know that light is not just a preference for vegetation. It is a strict requirement. Light is the fuel that drives the engine of photosynthesis, the process by which plants turn air and water into the sugar that builds their bodies. Without light, a plant is like a car with an empty tank. It stops, it starves, and eventually it dies. This biological fact makes the fossil forests of Antarctica one of the most baffling puzzles in the history of paleobotany. We have established that the climate was warm enough for trees, but temperature is only half the equation. The geometry of our solar system dictates that any landmass positioned at the polar latitudes must endure the polar night. For the trees of the Cretaceous Antarctica, this meant that for roughly 4 to 5 months of every year, the sun simply did not rise. Imagine the rhythm of this life. The summer would be a time of frantic, ceaseless activity, with the sun circling the horizon 24 hours a day, bathing the forest in a continuous, low-angle golden light. But then, as April approached, the days would shorten rapidly. The sun would dip below the horizon for longer and longer periods until, finally, it set and did not return. The forest would be plunged into a twilight that deepened into a profound darkness. The moon and the stars would be the only sources of illumination for months. And yet, the fossil record is clear. The forests did not just survive. They thrived. They produced biomass at rates comparable to modern temperate forests. How did they achieve this metabolic miracle in the dark? To understand this, scientists have looked closely at the physiology of the fossil leaves found in places like Alexander Island and the Transantarctic Mountains. What they found is a phenomenon known as polar gigantism. When you look at the leaves of the ancient Antarctic trees, particularly the angiosperms, flowering plants, that began to appear later in the period, they are often surprisingly large. They are thin, broad, and flat. This is likely an adaptation to the low angle of the sun. Even in the summer, the sun at the South Pole never rises high in the sky. It schemes the horizon, casting long shadows. This means the light is diffuse and weak compared to the direct intensity of the equator. To capture enough energy to grow, the trees had to become solar collectors of immense efficiency. By growing larger leaves, they increased their surface area, allowing them to grab every available photon during the long summer days. But the real challenge was the winter. Darkness presents a double threat to plants. The first threat is starvation. Plants breathe. Just like animals, they consume oxygen and burn sugars to maintain their cells, a process called respiration. During the day, photosynthesis produces more sugar than respiration consumes, so the plant grows. But in the dark, photosynthesis stops. The plant must switch to running entirely on its stored reserves. If the winter is cold, this is easy. In a cold winter, the plant's metabolism slows down to a crawl. It enters a state of dormancy, essentially pressing the pause button on life. It burns almost no energy, but the Antarctic winters of the Cretaceous were not freezing. They were cool, perhaps 5 or 6 degrees Celsius on average, but not cold enough to completely shut down the metabolic engines of the trees. This created a dangerous situation known to botanists as a warm, dark winter. The warmth kept the trees' metabolism running, forcing them to burn through their sugar reserves at a high rate. But the darkness meant they couldn't replenish those stores. A modern tree placed in these conditions would effectively starve to death before spring arrived. It would respire all its carbon away and die of exhaustion. The Antarctic trees had to evolve a specific type of dormancy. They had to decouple their metabolism from the temperature. They developed a chemical trigger, likely linked to the changing length of the day photoperiodism, that told them to shut down their systems and stop growing, even if the air remained warm. They had to force themselves into sleep to conserve energy. This leads to the great debate of the deciduous versus evergreen strategies. For a long time, scientists assumed that all polar trees must have been deciduous, meaning they dropped their leaves in winter. It makes sense logically. Why keep a leaf if there is no light? A leaf in the dark is a liability. It costs energy to maintain but provides nothing in return. And indeed, the ginkgo trees and the Nothofagus, southern beech, ancestors we find were deciduous. They would have turned the Antarctic autumn into a spectacle of gold and red before dropping their leaves to create a thick, insulating blanket on the forest floor. But the conifers, the araucarians and podocarps, tell a different story. These trees were evergreen. We know this because replacing a full canopy of needles every year is an enormous energy cost, one that slow-growing conifers generally avoid. So, these giants held onto their needles through the long, dark winter. This suggests that their needles were chemically hardened. They likely packed their cells with antifreeze proteins and lipids to protect structures from the occasional frost, while simultaneously lowering their respiration rate to near zero. They stood in the blackness, motionless, silent sentinels waiting for the first hint of the returning sun. The structure of the forest itself was also adapted to the light. We mentioned earlier that the forests were open woodlands. This spacing was crucial. If the trees grew too close together, as they do in the Amazon, the low-angle sun of the polar summer would only hit the very tops of the canopy. The trees cast shadows that are miles long by spacing themselves out. The trees ensured that even with the sun low on the horizon, light could penetrate deep into the forest, reaching the lower branches and the understory. This architecture allowed the ferns on the forest floor to flourish. It created a layered ecosystem where light was shared rather than monopolized. We also see evidence of rapid, almost frantic growth in the spring. As soon as the sun returned, the forest exploded into activity. The wide growth rings in the fossil would show that once the light was back, the trees wasted no time. They had to do a year's worth of growing in just 6 or 7 months. This required a highly efficient transport system for water and nutrients. The visual image of this forest is haunting. Imagine standing there in late June. It is noon, but the sky is a deep, bruised purple. The southern lights, the aurora australis, are dancing overhead, casting ghostly curtains of green and violet light over the landscape. Below, the forest is a sea of shadows. The giant trunks of the araucarians rise up like pillars of a ruined temple, disappearing into the gloom. The ground is silent, cushioned by thick moss. The air is cool and damp. There is no wind, for the temperature difference that drives fierce storms is absent and this eternal night. The trees are waiting. They are burning their fat, chemically speaking, holding on until the planet tilts back. It is a high-stakes gamble played out on a continental scale. Every year, they bet their lives that the sun will return before their reserves run out. And for millions of years, they won that bet. But trees were not the only inhabitants of this twilight world. A forest, no matter how strange, creates niches. And where there are niches, nature fills them with creatures. In the shadows of the araucarians, something was moving. Something warm-blooded, sharp-eyed, and perfectly adapted to a life of extremes. The green Antarctica was not empty. It was the hunting ground of the polar dinosaurs. 5. If the existence of forests at the South Pole is a paradox, the presence of dinosaurs within them is a challenge to our imagination. When we think of dinosaurs, we often picture them basking in the tropical heat of the Jurassic, swamp-dwelling behemoths or sun-loving predators. We think of reptiles, and reptiles, as a rule, require external heat. A lizard in the snow is a dead lizard. But the dinosaurs of Antarctica were different. They were the pioneers of the cold, the residents of the shadows. They proved that dinosaurs were not just biological machines dependent on the sun, but adaptable, resilient creatures capable of conquering the most hostile environments on Earth. For decades, the idea of Antarctic dinosaurs was pure speculation. We knew they were in Australia and South America, so they had to have crossed the bridge. But the ice kept its secrets well. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s that the first definitive proof emerged, and when it did, it changed our understanding of dinosaur physiology forever. The first major character in the story comes from the early Jurassic, a time slightly older than our Cretaceous forests, but essential for understanding the lineage of this continent. High in the Transantarctic Mountains, at a place called Mount Kirkpatrick, scientists discovered the bones of a predator. They named it Cryolophosaurus elioti, the frozen crested lizard. Cryolophosaurus was a substantial animal, reaching lengths of over 20 feet. But its most striking feature was the crest on its head. Unlike other dinosaurs that sported crests running from front to back, Cryolophosaurus had a bizarre, Spanish comb-like crest that ran side to side across its skull. It looked like a flamboyant crown. Finding a large predator like this so close to the pole tells us that the ecosystem was rich enough to support the top of the food chain. Predators are metabolically expensive. They need a lot of meat. For Cryolophosaurus to exist, there must have been herds of herbivores to feed it. And indeed, alongside it, we find the remains of Glacialosaurus, a long-necked plant-eater sauropodomorph that browsed the high branches of the early Antarctic forests. But as we move forward into the Cretaceous, the time of our lush open woodlands, the dinosaurs change. They become smaller, faster, and more specialized. The star of the Cretaceous polar forest is a small ornithopod known as Leelinosaura. Although originally discovered in the chaotic fossil beds of Dinosaur Cove in Australia, Leelinosaura represents the fauna that would have inhabited the Antarctic Circle when the two continents were joined. Leelinosaura was small, perhaps the size of a turkey or a small kangaroo, and it walked on two legs. But what makes it fascinating is its face. The skull of this animal shows disproportionately large eye sockets. These were not the eyes of a diurnal animal that sleeps when the sun goes down. These were the eyes of a nocturnal specialist that in the endless dark of the Antarctic winter. Leelinosaura didn't sleep for months like a hibernating bear. It stayed active. Its massive eyes allowed it to forage in the low light of the moon and stars, picking its way through the ferns to find roots, fungi, and insects. But activity requires heat. The discovery of these active winter dinosaurs was the final nail in the coffin of the cold-blooded dinosaur theory. An ectothermic reptile, like a crocodile or an iguana, could not survive an active winter at 70 degrees south. Even if it didn't freeze to death, it would become so sluggish it couldn't forage or escape predators. Leelinosaura and its kin must have been endothermic, warm-blooded. They had internal furnaces that kept their bodies at a constant temperature, regardless of the chill outside. They likely had another adaptation to keep that heat in. Feathers. We now know that many small dinosaurs were feathered. In the context of Antarctica, feathers were not just for display. They were survival gear. A coat of thick, downy protofeathers would have trapped body heat, acting like a high-performance parka. Imagine a small, fluffy, large-eyed dinosaur hopping silently through the dark, its breath puffing out in small clouds of steam as it hunted for beetles on the frozen moss. There were larger beasts here, too. On James Ross Island, paleontologists have found the armored remains of Antarctopelta, an ankylosaur. This was a tank of a creature covered in bony plates and spikes. Ankylosaurs are usually associated with warm, arid environments, but Antarctopelta lived in the cool, wet forests. How did a large herbivore survive the winter? Did it migrate? The concept of migration is tempting. We see caribou migrate today, but the distances involved in Gondwana were vast. To walk from the Antarctic Circle to a sunny latitude might have taken months. Burning more energy than it saved. It is more likely that these animals were permanent residents. They toughed it out. They may have switched their diet in winter, moving from fresh leaves to coarser foods like bark, twigs, and roots. Or perhaps they slowed down, entering a state of torpor, not a full hibernation, but a period of reduced activity where they huddled together for warmth in the sheltered valleys. The absence of certain animals tells a story as well. In the fossil beds of the Antarctic Cretaceous, we find almost no crocodilians, turtles, or lizards. These cold-blooded animals are abundant in the fossil records of Africa and South America from the same time. Their absence in Antarctica is the thermometer of the past. It tells us that while the summers were warm enough for them, the winters were the filter. The winter temperatures dropped just low enough to kill anything that couldn't generate its own heat. This created a unique kingdom. It was a land ruled by the warm-blooded, the dinosaurs, the early mammals, and the birds. It was an ecosystem defined by a thermal barrier. The silence of the winter forest would have been profound, but it was not empty. If you listened closely in the dark, you might hear the crunch of an Antarctipelta chewing on tough pine branches. You might hear the rustle of a Leelinosaura dashing through the ferns. You might hear the call of a primitive bird echoing through the canopy. It was a functional, thriving biome, a world that had solved the problems of its environment through millions of years of evolution. It seemed stable. It seemed like it would last forever. The greenhouse was robust, the carbon cycle was balanced, and life was abundant. But the universe is violent, and stability is often an illusion. Far to the north, in a shallow sea near what is now Mexico, a rock the size of a mountain was hurting through the vacuum of space. It didn't care about the delicate adaptations of the polar forests. It was coming to reset the clock, and when it arrived, the sky would fall even at the bottom of the world. 66 million years ago, the Cretaceous period ended not with a whimper, but with a bang that shook the foundations of the planet. The Chicxulub impactor, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers wide, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 100 million megatons of TNT. The immediate effects were local but apocalyptic. A shockwave flattened North America. Tsunamis taller than skyscrapers raced across the Gulf of Mexico. Molten rock rained down from the sky, igniting wildfires that consumed entire continents. But Antarctica was far away. It was on the exact opposite side of the globe, as far from ground zero as it was possible to be. You might think that distance would offer safety. You might imagine that while the dinosaurs of North America burned, the herds of Antarctipelta in the southern forests simply looked up at a strange flash in the northern sky and went back to grazing. You would be wrong. The impact was not a local event. It was a systemic collapse of the Earth's atmosphere. The asteroid pulverized the limestone bedrock of the impact site, vaporizing billions of tons of sulfur and rock dust and injecting them straight into the stratosphere. The winds of the upper atmosphere grabbed this veil of death and wrapped it around the globe within days. The sun vanished. For the tropical world, this was an instant death sentence. The plants of the equator were addicted to sunlight. They needed it every day. When the darkness fell, a darkness deep enough to stop photosynthesis entirely, the food chain snapped at its base. The herbivores starved, the carnivores followed, and within months, the great dynasties of the dinosaurs were dust. But in Antarctica, something strange happened. The asteroid struck by chance during the Antarctic summer. It should have been the time of light. Instead, the sky turned a bruised, chokehold gray, and then black. The temperature plummeted. The nuclear winter had begun. However, the killing mechanism of the KPG extinction, darkness and cold, was something the Antarctic ecosystem had already rehearsed for. For millions of years, the plants and animals of the South had evolved to survive months of darkness. They had evolved to deal with stopping photosynthesis. They had evolved to tolerate cold snaps. When the asteroid's curtain fell, the Antarctic forests didn't panic. Biologically speaking, they just assumed winter had come early. The trees, sensing the drop in light and temperature, triggered their dormancy mechanisms. They shut down their systems, conserved their sugars, and went to sleep. The small, feathered dinosaurs huddled in their burrows, tapping into the survival strategies they used every year. This is not to say it was easy. The impact winter lasted not just for a season, but perhaps for years. The cold was deeper and more biting than any natural winter they had faced. Many species died. The large dinosaurs, unable to find the vast quantities of food they needed, perished in the snows. The specialized marine reptiles in the surrounding oceans, dependent on a collapsing food web, vanished. But compared to the rest of the world, the extinction in the high southern latitudes was, in some ways, less absolute for the flora. The forests were battered, but they were not annihilated. The root systems survived underground, insulated by the soil and the snow. The seeds lay dormant, waiting for a signal that the air was clear. When the dust finally settled and the sun broke through the haze years later, the world it illuminated was different. The non-avian dinosaurs were gone. The great reptiles were history, but the land was empty and ready for the taking. The first sign of recovery in Antarctica, and indeed around the world, is recorded in the rocks as the fern spike. Ferns are the ultimate survivors. They are the disaster response team of the plant kingdom. Their spores can travel thousands of miles on the wind, and they can colonize barren, scorched earth before anything else can take root in the sediment layers of Antarctica that mark the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods. We see a sudden explosion of fern spores. It tells us that the continent was covered in a riot of green fronds. It was a pioneer landscape, a healing scab over the wound of the extinction. For thousands of years, Antarctica was a continent of ferns. But slowly, the great trees returned. The conifers, the podocarps, and araucarians grew back from their surviving roots or from seeds that had outlasted the cold. The nothofagus forests expanded. But the cast of characters in the animal world had changed forever. The Cryolophosaurus and Leelinosaura were gone, leaving only ghosts in the rock. In their place, the survivors emerged from the wreckage. The birds, the avian dinosaurs, had made it. They were small, mobile, and intelligent. And along with them, the mammals survived. These were small, shrew-like creatures that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs for eons. Now, the shadows were gone. The post-impact world, the Paleogene, saw Antarctica enter a new phase. It didn't freeze over immediately. In fact, the most lush, most tropical phase of Antarctic history was yet to come. The extinction event had cleared the slate, but the greenhouse conditions were about to return with a vengeance. The paradox of the KPG event is that while it destroyed the old world, it acted as a selective filter that favored the polar adaptations. The darkness that killed the tropics was just another Tuesday for the South. This resilience set the stage for the final, glorious act of the green Antarctica. As the Earth recovered, carbon dioxide levels began to rise again due to massive volcanic activity in the North Atlantic. The planet began to warm up. The ice that might have encroached during the impact winter retreated. We are now moving toward the Eocene epoch. This is the time when Antarctica became truly lush. It was no longer just an open woodland of conifers. It was becoming a true rainforest, resembling the temperate jungles of Valdivia in Chile or the fern gullies of Tasmania. But this new Eden was missing its kings. The dragons were dead. The throne of the top predator was empty, and nature abhors a vacuum. In the absence of the large reptilian carnivores, evolution looked at the survivors and chose a new, terrifying ruler for the southern continent. It wasn't a mammal. Mammals were still small, humble things. The new terror of the Antarctic forests walked on two legs, had a beak like an axe, and stood taller than a man. The birds were about to take charge. If the Cretaceous was the age of the gymnosperm, the stiff, needle-leaved conifers standing like sentinels in the mist, then the Eocene was the riot of the flowering plants. We are moving forward in time now, roughly 50 million years ago. The dust of the asteroid impact has long settled. The dinosaurs are a memory frozen in the rock layers below, and Earth has entered a fever dream. The Eocene epoch is known to geologists as the greenhouse Earth at its absolute peak. During a specific interval known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, PETM, a massive injection of carbon into the atmosphere caused global temperatures to skyrocket. It was a time when crocodiles swam in the Arctic Ocean and palm trees grew in Alaska. But nowhere was this transformation more dramatic or more beautiful than in Antarctica. To see this world, we must return to the Antarctic Peninsula, specifically to a small, wind-swept strip of land called Seymour Island. To the modern eye, Seymour Island is a desolate moonscape of gravel and dust, scoured by polar winds. But to a paleontologist, it is the Rosetta Stone of the Southern Hemisphere. It holds one of the most continuous and detailed records of life from this period anywhere on Earth. If you stood on Seymour Island 50 million years ago, you would not need a coat. The mean annual temperature was about 13 degrees Celsius, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the average temperature of San Francisco or London today. But averages can be deceiving. In the summer, the mercury would climb into the 20s, 70s Fahrenheit. It was genuinely pleasantly warm. The forest that covered the land had changed. The open, pillar-like woodlands of the Cretaceous were gone. In their place stood a dense, chaotic, multi-layered rainforest that looked remarkably like the Valdivian temperate rainforests of southern Chile or the deep wilderness of Tasmania today. The dominant tree was the Nothofagus, the southern beech. These are beautiful trees with small, crinkled leaves that turn brilliant colors in the fall. In the Eocene Antarctica, they formed a closed canopy, locking arms to create a ceiling of green. Below them grew laurels, myrtles, and proteas, plants with showy, complex flowers. The presence of these plants tells us something vital about the climate. It wasn't just warm, it was frost-free. Many of the species found in the Eocene fossil beds of Seymour Island are thermophilic or heat-loving. They cannot survive freezing temperatures. Their presence means that even in the dead of the polar winter, when the sun vanished for months, the temperature stayed above zero. How is that possible? How does a land with no sun stay warm? The answer lies in the oceans and the atmosphere working in concert. The oceans of the Eocene were hot, perhaps 10 degrees warmer than today. This vast thermal mass acted as a hot water bottle for the continent. Warm currents flowed south from the tropics, hugging the coastlines of Antarctica and releasing their heat into the air. Simultaneously, the atmosphere was thick with greenhouse gases, likely exceeding 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. This blanket trapped the infrared radiation radiating from the ground, preventing the heat from escaping into space during the long night. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing heat engine. The result was a biological anomaly, a subtropical rainforest operating in a photoperiodic twilight zone. The fossils from this time are exquisite. We find fern fronds preserved in such detail you can see the spore cases. We find the fossilized bacteria that lived on the leaves. We find evidence of a complex fungal network that recycled the nutrients on the forest floor, breaking down the massive amount of leaf litter that accumulated every autumn. Because these forests were deciduous, the autumns must have been spectacular. Imagine the entire continent of Antarctica turning from deep green to blazing red, copper, and gold as April arrived. Then, in a synchronized event, billions of tons of leaves would fall, carpeting the ground in a rustling layer of insulation that protected the roots and the small burrowing animals from the cooling air. For months, the trees stood bare, their gray branches stark against the auroras and the stars. To a human observer, it might have looked like a dead forest. But inside, the sap was still fluid, the cells were alive, waiting for the sunrise. We also see evidence of a connection to South America that was still strong. The Videlian biogeographic province is the scientific name for this shared ecosystem. It was a continuous belt of life. Animals could migrate from the tip of Patagonia into the Antarctic Peninsula without crossing open ocean. This connection allowed for an exchange of seeds and spores that kept the Antarctic flora diverse. It wasn't an isolated outpost. It was part of a thriving neighborhood. However, there is a melancholy to the Eocene forests of Antarctica. When we look at them, we are looking at the last zenith. This was the highest point, the moment of greatest lushness before the long, slow decline. It was the Indian summer of the continent. The planet was about to change. The forces that created this warmth were precarious. The carbon pulse would eventually be absorbed. The tectonic plates were moving, preparing to break the bridges that kept Antarctica warm. But before the cold came, before the glaciers began their march, this lush, warm, dark forest played host to one of evolution's most fascinating experiments. With the dinosaurs gone and mammals still figuring out how to be big, the Antarctic forests became a kingdom ruled by a different kind of bipod. The birds were in charge. When the asteroid wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, it left a power vacuum at the top of the food chain. In most of the world, mammals rose to fill that void. Over millions of years, they grew from shrew-sized hiders into the wolves, lions, elephants, and whales we know today. But in Antarctica, isolation led to a different outcome. The mammals were there. We have found the teeth and jawbones of small marsupials and a strange, extinct group called Gondwanathers, but they remained relatively small. They were the underdogs, scurrying through the leaf litter of the Nothofagus forests. The real giants of the Eocene Antarctica were the birds. The fossil beds of Seymour Island and the surrounding areas have yielded remains that paint a picture of an avian apex. In this lost world, birds didn't just fly. They ruled the land and the sea with a size and ferocity that challenges our modern perception of what a bird can be. The most famous of these residents were the penguins. But these were not the cute, waddling emperor penguins we see in documentaries today. These were monsters. Anthropornis nordensjoeldi is the heavyweight champion of this era. Its name means man-bird, a nod to its stature, standing nearly 6 feet tall, 1.8 meters, and weighing upwards of 200 pounds, 90 kilograms. This penguin could look a human in the it had a massive, elongated beak, far longer and sharper than modern penguins. In the warm, fish-filled waters off the coast of the green Antarctica, Anthropornis was a formidable predator. It didn't need ice to breed. It nested on the rocky, fern-covered beaches, likely waddling into the forest margins to shelter its chicks from storms. Alongside Anthropornis, there were other giants like Paleodyps, sometimes called the Colossus penguin. These birds were so large that when their first fragmentary bones were found, scientists thought they belonged to whales or large turtles. It took time to realize they were looking at the ribcage of a bird. But the dominance of birds wasn't limited to the ocean. There is tantalizing evidence that the forests themselves were patrolled by avian predators in South America. During this same period, the top predators were the forest wrasses, known popularly as terror birds. These were flightless, carnivorous birds with massive, hooked beaks and powerful legs capable of running down prey at high speeds. They were the biological heirs to the velociraptors. Because Antarctica and South America were still connected by a land bridge, it is highly probable that terror birds stalked the Antarctic woods. Fossil evidence is frustratingly rare. Bird bones are hollow and fragile, and they do not preserve well in the rough sediments of a riverbed. However, isolated finds on Seymour Island, including a massive carnivorous beak tip and large ungual claw bones, suggest that forest wrasses or close relatives were present. Imagine walking through the Eocene forest. The light is dim, filtered through the beech leaves. Suddenly, the silence is broken by a low, guttural booming sound. Stepping out from the ferns is a creature 7 feet tall. It has the body of an ostrich but the head of an eagle, magnified to nightmare proportions. It fixes you with a stare that is entirely reptilian. In the absence of placental carnivores like wolves or cats, these birds were the tigers of the Antarctic. They hunted the small marsupials and the slow-moving herbivores that browsed on the forest floor. The skies, too, were filled with strange shapes. We find the bones of pelagornithids, the bony-toothed birds. These ocean-going wanderers had wingspans that could reach 20 feet, 6 meters. They looked like albatrosses on steroids, but their beaks were lined with jagged, tooth-like projections of bone, perfect for snatching slippery squid and fish from the surface of the water. This avian dominance tells us that the ecosystem of the green Antarctica was fundamentally different from the mammalian-dominated world we live in. It was a lost world in the truest sense, a pocket of time where the rules of the Cenozoic had not yet fully applied. The mammals that did live here were survivors of an ancient lineage. The Gondwanathers, for instance, are a puzzle. They had high-crowned teeth adapted for grinding tough vegetation, suggesting they were the grazers of this ecosystem. For a long time, we thought they went extinct with the dinosaurs, but in Antarctica, they held on, protected by the isolation and the unique forest environment. There were also the ancestors of the Manito del Monte, a tiny marsupial that lives in the bamboo forests of Chile today. Fossil finds show that its family tree goes straight back to the Eocene Antarctica. It is a living thread connecting the modern world to the ghost forests. This ecosystem was lush, vibrant, and loud with the calls of giant penguins and the shrieks of toothed seabirds. It was a biological laboratory running at full capacity. But biology is always at the mercy of geology. The birds and the forests didn't know it, but the ground beneath their feet was moving. The land bridge that connected them to South America, their lifeline to the warmth of the north, was under immense strain. The tectonic plates were pulling apart. The divorce of the continents was final, and the isolation of Antarctica was about to begin. Geology is often described as a science of slow violence. Continents do not pull apart gently. They tear, they rift, they quake, and when they finally separate, the consequences can alter the destiny of the entire planet. For nearly 100 million years, Antarctica had been the introvert of the continental family, sticking to the pole. But it had always kept a hand held out to its neighbors. To the east, it held onto Australia. To the west, it gripped the tip of South America. These connections were physical barriers that stopped the ocean from circling the world. They forced the water to move north and south, mixing warm equatorial water with the polar seas. This mixing was the heating system of the planet. It was the reason the Eocene forests could survive at the pole. As long as the warm water could reach the coast, the frost was kept at bay. But about 45 to 40 million years ago, the engine of the Earth began to dismantle this system. The first break happened with Australia. For eons, the two continents had been fused along a vast suture line. But as the Australian plate moved north, driven by the spreading ridges in the Indian Ocean, the crust began to stretch and thin. Finally, the land snapped. The Tasman Gateway opened at a T1st. It was just a shallow seaway, a marshy inlet that might have looked like the Florida Everglades. But as the gap widened, the ocean poured in. Deep water began to flow between Tasmania and East Antarctica. This was a blow, but it wasn't the fatal one. Antarctica still held onto South America via the Drake Passage. This narrow isthmus was the last thread, the final umbilical cord, connecting the polar continent to the warmth of the rest of the world. The tension on this land bridge must have been immense. Earthquakes would have been a daily reality for the animals living on the peninsula. Volcanoes erupted along the spine of the connection as the crust fractured. Then, roughly 35 to 30 million years ago, the exact dates are still debated by geologists, but the sequence is clear: the Drake Passage opened. The South American plate pulled away to the north and west. The bridge collapsed into the sea. The moment deep water connected the Pacific to the Atlantic south of Cape Horn, the world changed forever. With both the Tasman Gateway and the Drake Passage open, there was nothing to stop the wind and the water. The westerly winds, which blow relentlessly from west to east in the southern hemisphere, suddenly had a clear path around the globe. They began to drive the ocean in a continuous, uninterrupted loop. This was the birth of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, ACC. The ACC is the strongest ocean current on Earth. It transports 130 million cubic meters of water per second, more than all the rivers of the world combined. But its power isn't just in its volume, it is in its function. The ACC acts as a wall. It circles Antarctica, racing clockwise, and it effectively cuts the continent off from the rest of the planet. It traps the cold water near the pole and prevents the warm, tropical waters from reaching the south. Before the ACC, the ocean brought heat to Antarctica. After the ACC, the ocean kept the heat out. The formation of this current was the turning point. It was the moment the greenhouse began to collapse into the icehouse. Inside the continent, the effect was gradual but relentless. The warm rains that had watered the Nothofagus forests began to cool. The summers grew shorter. The winters, once mild and frost-free, began to bite. The forests didn't disappear overnight. Evolution is stubborn. The trees tried to adapt. We see a shift in the fossil record. The thermophilic plants, the laurels and palms, vanished first. They couldn't handle the new chill. The diversity of the forest dropped. The Nothofagus held on. It is a tough tree capable of tolerating cold. But even the southern beach has its limits. As the temperature dropped, the trees retreated from the interior. They moved toward the coasts, where the ocean still offered a little moderation. The high mountains, once covered in green, began to accumulate snow that didn't melt in the summer. Year after year, the layers of white built up. The first glaciers were born, not the continent-spanning monsters of today, but small alpine glaciers nested in the valleys of the Gamburtsev and Transantarctic Mountains. This was the beginning of the Great Cooling. It was a slow-motion catastrophe for the life that had called Antarctica home for millions of years. The lush, dark paradise was ending. The white desert was beginning to grow. But nature rarely goes quietly. Even as the ice began to form, there were pockets of resistance. There were last stands. And the story of how the forests died is not just one of ice-crushing trees. It is a story of a long twilight struggle against the inevitable. To understand how a continent dies, or at least how it falls into a frozen slumber, we must look away from the land and stare into the sea. The death of the green Antarctica did not begin with a drop in temperature on the mountains. It began with a shift in the motion of the water. We have spoken of the separation of the continents, the slow, agonizing tear that pulled South America away from the Antarctic Peninsula. When that final thread snapped and the Drake Passage opened, it was not merely a change in geography. It was the unlocking of a cage. For millions of years, the ocean currents had been forced to move north and south, blocked by the land bridges. This meridional flow was the planet's heating system. It took the warm, sun-drenched water from the equator and pumped it down to the high latitudes, like blood flowing to the fingertips. It kept the extremities warm. But when the Drake Passage and the Tasman Gateway both yawned open, there was nothing left to stop the water. The winds of the southern hemisphere, the ferocious westerlies that howl endlessly around the bottom of the world, grabbed the surface of the ocean and began to push without land to block it. The water picked up speed. It began to spin. It formed a continuous, unbroken loop of moving water circling the continent from west to east. This is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, or the ACC. Today, the ACC is the mightiest river on Earth. It is difficult to comprehend its scale. It moves roughly 130 million cubic meters of water every single day. To put that in perspective, that is more than 100 times the flow of all the world's rivers combined. It reaches from the surface down to depths of 2,000 meters or more. It is a wall of water. And that wall is exactly what killed the greenhouse. The physics of this current created a phenomenon known as thermal isolation. As the water spins around the continent, it creates a vortex. It effectively traps the cold water near the pole and prevents the warm, subtropical water from crossing the line. It acts like a force field. The heat from the north pushes against it, but the ACC pushes back, deflecting the warmth away. Inside this circle, the temperature began to plummet. The ocean, which had acted as a hot water bottle for the continent for 50 million years, turned into a refrigerator. The air above the ocean cooled down, and because the wind blows from the sea to the land, the continent began to freeze. This transition, known as the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, happened roughly 34 million years ago. It is one of the most dramatic climate shifts in the history of the planet. It was the moment Earth officially switched from a greenhouse state to an icehouse state. But the current was not acting alone. While the ACC was locking the door, the atmosphere was lowering the thermostat. During the Eocene, carbon dioxide levels had been high, perhaps 1,000 parts per million or more. But by the time the Oligocene arrived, those levels had dropped significantly, likely falling below 600 parts per million. The cause of this drop is still a subject of scientific debate. Some point to the massive weathering of the Himalayas, which were rising as India slammed into Asia. Fresh rock pulls carbon from the air as it erodes, acting like a planetary sponge. Others point to the Azala event, a bloom of freshwater ferns in the Arctic Ocean that sucked gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere and buried it in the seabed. Whatever the cause, the effect was synchronized with the opening of the Drake Passage. The blanket of CO2 was thinning just as the cold water began to circle. It was a perfect storm of cooling. Imagine standing on the coast of Antarctica during this transition. The change would not have been visible in a single lifetime, but over generations the difference would be stark. The rain, which used to be warm and gentle, turned into sleet. The fog, once a misty veil that watered the ferns, became a freezing shroud that coated the branches in rime ice. The storms grew violent. The temperature gradient between the freezing pole and the warm equator sharpened, fueling winds of terrifying speed. The roaring 40s and furious 50s were born. These winds battered the coastlines, stripping away the tall canopies of the ancient rainforests. The biological reaction to this was panic. Plants cannot move. They cannot migrate south to escape the cold because south is where the cold is coming from. They were trapped. The thermophilic species, the plants that needed warmth to survive, were the first casualties. The palms died out. The laurels withered. The complex, diverse understory of the Eocene forest collapsed. What remained was a simpler, harder ecosystem. The Nothofagus, the southern beech, became the sole ruler of the woods. It is a survivor. It can tolerate cold, wind, and poor soil, but even the Nothofagus was being pushed to its limits. The formation of the ACC also changed the chemistry of the ocean itself. Cold water holds more gas than warm water. As the Southern Ocean cooled, it began to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere even faster, creating a feedback loop. The colder it got, the more carbon it absorbed. The more carbon it absorbed, the colder it got. The ice began to accumulate. At first, it was just seasonal snow that lingered a little too long in the shadows of the valleys. Then it was small glaciers capping the highest peaks of the Gamburtsev Mountains in the center of the continent. But the ACC ensured that the summer warmth could no longer reach deep enough to melt the snow. The glaciers began to connect. They flowed down from the heights, coalescing into ice fields. They filled the valleys where the dinosaurs had once walked. They buried the fossil forests of the Cretaceous under weight and grinding friction. This was the beginning of the end for the green Antarctica. The continent was being sealed off from the world, hidden behind a curtain of wind and a moat of freezing water. The current that flows around it today is a monument to this event, a swirling, churning barrier that separates the living world from the frozen one. And 34 million years ago, as the current picked up speed, the lights of the forest began to flicker out, one by one. 34 million years ago, a silence fell over the southern world. It was the silence of the Oi-1 glaciation. This is the clinical, scientific name for a catastrophic event. The sudden, rapid expansion of ice sheets across the Antarctic continent. The transition from the lush Eocene to the frozen Oligocene was not a gentle slide. It was a cliff. In the geological blink of an eye, perhaps as little as 200,000 years, global temperatures crashed. The tropical paradise was gone. The world had turned gray and cold. For the forests of Antarctica, this was the great culling. The diversity that had defined the landscape for nearly 100 million years vanished. The complex web of life, with its giant birds, marsupials, and diverse flora unraveled. The interior of the continent, once the heart of the rainforest, became uninhabitable. As the ice sheets grew in the Gamburtsev Mountains, they created their own weather systems. A massive high-pressure system settled over the pole, pushing cold, dry air outward. This is the katabatic wind, a gravity-driven wind that falls from the high ice plateau toward the coast. These winds are killers. They are intensely cold and incredibly dry. As they swept down from the interior, they desiccated the landscape. The rainforests of the inland valleys didn't just freeze, they dried out. The moisture that the Nothofagus trees depended on was locked up in the growing ice sheet or blown away by the gale. The retreat was on. The green world shrank toward the edges of the continent. The only places where life could still hold on were the coastal lowlands and the peninsulas, where the ocean, despite being cold, still provided some moisture and moderated the temperature extremes. We can see this retreat in the sediment cores drilled from the ocean floor. In the Eocene layers, the mud is rich with pollen from 100 different species of plants. It is dark with organic matter. But as we cross the boundary into the Oligocene, the sediment changes. It becomes diamictite. This is a jumbled, chaotic rock type that is formed by glaciers. It contains pebbles and boulders that were plucked from the land by the ice, carried out to sea, and dropped as the icebergs melted. The appearance of diamictite is the smoking gun. It tells us that the ice had reached the sea. But the pollen tells an even sadder story. The diversity crashes. The palms and proteas disappear completely. The pollen record becomes dominated by a single genus, Nothofagus, and not the large-leaved varieties of the warm past, but a small, hardy shrub-like species. Alongside the pollen, the chemical signals change. The clay minerals, which form from the weathering of soil, shift from types that form in wet, chemical-rich environments to types that form by physical grinding. The land was no longer rotting and growing. It was being scraped and shattered. Yet, life is stubborn. Even in the Oligocene, Antarctica was not fully white. It was a patchwork. Imagine the coastline of the Ross Sea 30 million years ago. Behind you, the mountains are white, buried under the expanding ice sheet. The glaciers are pouring down the valleys, their snouts calving into the gray ocean. But in front of the glaciers, on the flat outwash plains, there is still green. It is a tundra forest. The trees are stunted, gnarled, and twisted by the wind. They are Nothofagus trees, but they grow in low, dense mats or thickets, huddled together to preserve heat. The ground is covered in moss and hardy ferns. There are no giant penguins walking here. The Anthropornis is gone, replaced by smaller, more specialized penguins that are better adapted to the cold water. The terrestrial animals are few. Maybe a few small, burrowing mammals survive in the root systems, sleeping through the bitter winters. The silence of the amphibians is perhaps the most telling. Frogs and salamanders, which need liquid water and permeable skin to survive, vanished. Their disappearance marks the point where the land froze solid. Permafrost had begun to set in. The soil itself changed. In the warm times, the soil was deep, rich, and alive with bacteria and fungi. In the Oligocene, it became thin and rocky. The cold slowed down the decomposition process. Dead leaves didn't rot. They just dried out and blew away. The nutrient cycle, the heartbeat of the forest, slowed to a crawl. This period was a long, slow siege. For millions of years, the ice advanced and retreated, pulsating with the rhythms of the Earth's orbit. In slightly warmer intervals, the scrubby forests would march back up the valleys, reclaiming a few miles of ground. In the colder times, the ice would shove them back into the sea. It was a war of attrition. The ice had time on its side. It didn't need to eat. It didn't need light. It only needed cold. The forest needed warmth, water, and nutrients. Three things that were becoming scarcer by the century. But the most remarkable part of this story is not how quickly the forests died, but how long they refused to die. We used to think that the ice sheet covered the continent quickly and permanently 34 million years ago. We thought the book of life was closed then. But new evidence suggests something far more controversial. It suggests that the forests didn't just survive the Oligocene. They held on deep into the Neogene. They persisted on the flanks of the Transantarctic Mountains, watching the ice sheet grow, adapting, shrinking, and waiting. These are the ghost forests of the Pliocene. They are the subject of one of the most heated debates in modern geology. And they suggest that the green Antarctica did not die with a bang, but faded away like a dream in the morning light, lingering long after it should have been impossible. In the world of science, there are discoveries that fit neatly into the puzzle, and then there are discoveries that threaten to flip the table over. The Sirius group fossils are the latter. They are the most controversial leaves in the history of Antarctic research. The story begins in the Transantarctic Mountains, specifically in a high-altitude formation of glacial deposits known as the Sirius Group. These rocks sit high above the current ice level, near the Beardmore Glacier, the same place where Scott's men found their coal. But the Sirius Group is much younger. In the 1980s, paleontologists David Harwood and Peter Webb made a discovery here that shocked the community. Inside these glacial deposits, sandwiched between layers of gravel and mud, they found organic remains. They found wood. They found leaves. They found pollen. But these were not fossils from the deep time of the Cretaceous or the Eocene. These were fossils of Nothofagus beardmoriensis, a species of southern beech. And when they dated the microfossils found alongside them, the results were impossible to believe. The dating suggested these plants were from the Pliocene epoch, roughly 3 to 5 million years ago. Let that sink in. 3 million years ago is yesterday in geological time. By 3 million years ago, the human lineage was already walking upright in Africa. We assume that Antarctica was fully frozen, a dead block of ice, long before that. If Harwood and Webb were right, then the history of the Antarctic ice sheet is completely wrong. It would mean that as recently as 3 million years ago, the massive East Antarctic ice sheet collapsed. It would mean the ice melted back significantly, opening up seaways and exposing the flanks of the mountains. And on those exposed slopes, a forest grew. We call these the twilight forests. They were not the lush jungles of the past. They were the desperate, final survivors of the green world. Based on the leaves and the wood, we can reconstruct what they looked like. These were dwarf trees. Nothofagus beardmoriensis was likely a prostrate shrub, growing low to the ground like the creeping willows found in the Arctic today. It formed dense, tangled mats that hugged the rocky soil to escape the wind. The leaves were tiny, barely the size of a fingernail. They were crinkled and thick, adapted to conserve moisture in the dry, cold air. But they were deciduous. Every winter, as the sun vanished for the long polar night, these tiny shrubs would drop their leaves, entering a deep dormancy to survive temperatures that likely plunged to -20 degrees Celsius. But they were not alone. Inside the peat layers associated with these plants, scientists found the crushed remains of beetles. A specific weevil, Listrinotus, was identified. Weevils are hardy insects, but they cannot survive inside a block of solid ice. They need soil. They need plants to eat. They need a summer that is warm enough, perhaps 5 degrees Celsius, to move and reproduce. The existence of these beetles and shrubs paints a picture of a green ghost Antarctica. It suggests that the continent was not a monolithic block of white, but a dynamic, fluctuating landscape. It suggests that even after the great cooling of the Oligocene, the ice sheet was unstable. It could collapse and retreat, allowing life to recolonize the mountains from unknown refuges. Where did they hide during the deep freezes? Perhaps they clung to the islands off the coast, or in small, geothermally heated valleys near volcanoes. And when the climate warmed slightly in the Pliocene, they marched back up the slopes, reclaiming their ancestral home one last time. This theory sparked a civil war in geology. The stabilists argued that the East Antarctic ice sheet has been stable and frozen for 15 million years. They claimed the Sirius group fossils were moved there by wind or glaciers from older deposits, that they were reworked trash from the past. They argued that the dating was wrong, that the leaves were actually much older. The dynamicists, led by the discoverers, stood their ground. They pointed to the exquisite preservation of the leaves. Fragile leaves do not survive being ground up by a glacier and redeposited millions of years later. They look fresh. They retain their cellular structure. They look like they fell into the mud just yesterday. The debate rages on, but the consensus has slowly shifted toward a middle ground. We now know that the ice sheets are indeed more dynamic than we thought. Recent drilling projects have confirmed that the West Antarctic ice sheet has collapsed repeatedly in the past few million years. Whether the Sirius group forests are 3 million years old or 15 million years old, they represent the final chapter. They are the last stand. Imagine standing on the slopes of the Transantarctic Mountains in this twilight era. The valleys below you are filled with ice, but the ridges are bare rock. And clinging to that rock is a patch of rust-red scrub. It is autumn. The dwarf beech trees are turning color. The wind is biting. The sun is low. There are no birds singing. There are no large animals. It is a silent, miniature forest at the end of the world. It is the great-great-grandchild of the mighty rainforests that once hosted dinosaurs. It has shrunk, adapted, and suffered, but it is still here. That it is a testament to the resilience of life. Life does not give up territory easily. It holds on until the very physics of the planet make existence impossible. But eventually, the cold one, the Pliocene warmth faded. The Pleistocene ice ages began. The global temperature dropped further. The ice sheet thickened and expanded, grinding over the Sirius group deposits, burying the dwarf trees. The weevils froze. The roots snapped. The last leaf fell, and no bud opened to replace it. The green was gone. The white was absolute dot, or so we thought, because even as the ice buried the surface, it sealed away the landscape. It didn't just destroy, it preserved. Deep beneath the miles of ice that cover the interior today, there are mountains that no human eye has ever seen. And on those ghost mountains, the shape of the ancient rivers is still visible to our radar. That we are now going to journey under the ice to the ghost mountains of Gamburtsev, to see what the glaciers are hiding from us. In the heart of East Antarctica, at the very center of the ice sheet, lies a secret that defies the logic of geography. If you were to stand on the surface of the ice at Dome, the highest point of the Antarctic plateau, you would see nothing but a flat, blindingly white horizon stretching to infinity. The ice here is over 2 miles thick. It is a desert of silence, where the temperature can drop to minus 80 degrees Celsius. But if you could strip away that ice, if you could magically lift the white blanket, you would not see a flat plain. You would see the Alps. Buried beneath the deepest ice on Earth is a mountain range the size of the European Alps. These are the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. They have jagged peaks that rise 9,000 feet from the valley floors. They have deep river valleys, hanging cirques, and precipitous cliffs. And yet, not a single human eye has ever seen them. They are ghost mountains, known to us only through the echoes of radar waves. The discovery of the Gamburtsevs is one of the great stories of the Cold War era. In 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, a team of Soviet scientists was traversing the most inaccessible parts of the continent. They were driving heavy, tractor-like vehicles across the ice, setting off explosives every few miles. By listening to how long it took the sound waves to bounce off the bedrock and return to the surface, they were mapping the land beneath. They expected to find a flat crater, a depressed basin weighed down by the ice. Instead, their instruments showed something impossible. The echoes were bouncing back from jagged peaks. The rock was rising up to meet them. For decades, the existence of the Gamburtsevs was a geological headache. Mountains are usually formed by the collision of tectonic plates, like the Himalayas or the Alps. But the Gamburtsevs are in the middle of an ancient, stable continent. There hasn't been a collision there for hundreds of millions of years. Old mountains like the Appalachians or the Urals are supposed to be worn down, rounded, and smooth. But the radar pictures showed the Gamburtsevs were young, sharp, spiky, and rugged. How could an old mountain range look so young? The answer lies in the unique preservation power of the ice. The Antarctic ice sheet didn't just cover these mountains, it embalmed them. About 34 million years ago, when the Great Cooling began, the glaciers formed on the peaks of the Gamburtsevs first. At that time, the ice was cold-based, meaning it was frozen to the rock. It didn't slide. It didn't grind. It simply sat there, a protective shell that shielded the peaks from the wind and rain as the ice sheet grew. It filled the valleys, essentially freezing the landscape in time. The erosion stopped. The rivers that had carved the valleys were silenced. The landscape of the Eocene, the landscape of the green Antarctica, was locked in a cryogenic vault. When modern scientists, specifically the AGAP, Antarctica's Gamburtsev Province project, flew radar-equipped aircraft over the region in 2008, they saw something breathtaking. The radar penetrated the ice and painted a 3D map of the world below. They saw V-shaped valleys.in geomorphology. A V-shaped valley is the signature of a river. Glaciers carve U-shaped valleys, wide, flat-bottom troughs. But V-shapes are cut by running water. This means the radar was looking at the actual riverbeds that existed before the ice came. It is a landscape frozen in the moment of its death. We can see where the tributaries flowed. We can trace the path of the water that once watered the great Nothofagus forests. We can see the topography that challenged the dinosaurs. If we could drill down into those valleys, into the sediments preserved in the bottom of those ghostly riverbeds, we would likely find the holy grail of Antarctic paleontology, the soil of the last forest. we would find the pollen, the wood, perhaps even the mummified remains of the life that lived there just before the white curtain fell. But the Gamburtsevs hide an even deeper secret. The radar also revealed that in the deep valleys between the peaks, underneath miles of ice, there is liquid water. Heat from the Earth's core, combined with the immense pressure of the ice above, melts the base of the glacier. This water collects in vast subglacial lakes. The most famous is Lake Vostok, but there are hundreds of them connected by subglacial rivers. These are dark, pressurized ecosystems that have been cut off from the atmosphere for 15 million years or more. They are the closest thing on Earth to the oceans of Europa or Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Are they dead? Almost certainly not. Life is relentless. We expect to find, and are beginning to find, microbial life in these lakes. Bacteria that have evolved to live in the crushing dark, feeding on the minerals ground from the rock by the slow movement of the ice. These microbes are the last living residents of the Ghost Mountains. They are the descendants of the surface life that retreated into the deep as the world froze. They adapted to a slow, cold, dark existence, waiting for a thaw that might never come. The Gamburtsev Mountains are a reminder of how little we know about our own planet. We have mapped the surface of Mars in greater detail than the bedrock of Antarctica. There is a continent the size of the United States and Mexico combined, sitting right there, and we have only scratched the surface of its history. The ice sheet acts as a white noise that obscures the signal of the past. It smooths over the complexity, hiding the scars and the stories. But it is also the reason the stories still exist. Without the ice, the Gamburtsevs would have eroded away millions of years ago. The fossils would have turned to dust. The evidence of the rivers would be gone. The ice is a paradox. It is the destroyer of life, but the preserver of memory. It killed the forest, but it kept the grave intact. As we stare at the radar maps of these jagged, ghost-like peaks, we are looking at a phantom limb of the Earth, a piece of the planet that is still there, still sharp, still imposing, but utterly removed from our reality. It is a landscape of the imagination, preserved in the most hostile sanctuary on Earth. But sanctuaries are not violated without consequence. And the sanctuary of the ice is breaking. The world above is warming, and the heat is starting to knock on the door of the Ghost Mountains. The archives are beginning to melt. We began this journey with a question. What were the forests of Antarctica like before the glaciers came? We have traveled through deep time, walking among the giant ferns of the Cretaceous, standing in the shadow of the Araucarian pines, watching the Cryolophosaurus hunt in the winter twilight, and hearing the boom of the terror birds in the Eocene rainforest. We have seen the continent drift, the currents shift, and the white curtain of ice fall, sealing the green world away. We have looked at the ghost mountains that still hold the shape of the ancient rivers. But every story about the past is ultimately a story about the present. And today, the story of Antarctica is changing faster than it has at any time in the last 30 million years. We are living in an era of rapid unspooling. The carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere have crossed 420 parts per million, levels not seen since the Pliocene, the time of the twilight forests. If we continue on our current trajectory, we may reach levels not seen since the Eocene, the time of the rainforests. The ice is reacting. The glaciers of West Antarctica are retreating. The ice shelves that guard the coast are fracturing. And as they pull back, they are revealing the archives they have guarded for so long on James Ross Island, on Seymour Island, And in the dry valleys, the melting ice is spitting out fossils. It is a grim irony. We are destroying the cryosphere, but in doing so, we are recovering the memory of the biosphere. Every year, paleontologists find new bones, new leaves, new clues that were previously locked under meters of frozen water. But this is not a fair trade. The melting of Antarctica is not a return to Eden. It is a warning. The geological record tells us that the greenhouse Earth is a very different planet from the one our civilization was built for. The Eocene world had sea levels 70 meters higher than today. If we return to those conditions, most of our major cities, New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai, will be underwater. The forests of the past tell us that the climate system is sensitive. It has tipping points. The formation of the Antarctic circumpolar current and the sudden drop in CO2 34 million years ago flipped the switch from green to white. We are now flicking that switch in the other direction. But the speed is the danger. The changes we described tonight happened over millions of years. Life had time to migrate, to adapt, to evolve. We are compressing those changes into centuries. The Nothofagus cannot walk fast enough to keep up with the shifting climate zones of the Anthropocene. Yet, there is a profound beauty in the resilience we have witnessed. Antarctica teaches us that life is tenacious. It hung on in the dark. It hung on in the cold. It persisted on the flanks of volcanoes and in the cracks of the rocks long after the odds had turned to zero. The Earth is cyclic. The ice is just a phase. In the long view of geology, the view of deep time, the ice caps are temporary anomalies. The normal state of our planet is green. Someday, perhaps millions of years from now, the wheel will turn again. The ice will vanish. The rivers of the Gamburtsev Mountains will flow again. Seeds that have been dormant or spores carried on the wind will touch the soil. A new forest will grow at the South Pole. It will not be the same forest. The Cryolophosaurus will not return. The Anthropornis will not waddle on the beaches. Evolution does not repeat itself. It rhymes. New creatures, descendants of the survivors of our age, will walk under the new canopy. They will live in the cycles of the polar night and the midnight sun. And perhaps, if an intelligent species is there to see it, they will look at the rocks and find the thin, strange layer of plastic and concrete that marks our time. They will wonder about us. They will wonder about the ice people who lived during the brief, frozen interval of the planet's history. Will they understand that we looked back? Will they know that we tried to listen to the whispers of the ghosts beneath the ice? The story of the green Antarctica is a mirror. It shows us what the Earth is capable of. It shows us that the hostility of the present is not absolute. Beneath the white armor of the South Pole beats the heart of a living, breathing continent, waiting for its turn to wake up. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the image of the white desert fade. Replace it with the smell of damp moss and pine needles. Replace the howling wind with the call of a strange bird echoing through a misty, sunless forest. The Earth is not just where we live. It is a keeper of secrets. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough to the rocks and the ice, it tells us exactly who it used to be. Thank you for journeying with me into the deep past tonight. If you enjoyed this walk through the lost forests of the bottom of the world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep the lantern lit so we can find more mysteries in the dark. Until next time, sleep well and keep wondering.